All right, so we're playing now, and we thank on such short notice Aaron Freeman. We mentioned Falcons prophet. Now, that's big league language right there now. I mean, the Falcons prophet, host of Locked On Falcons podcast, writes occasionally one of the great nicknames we were talking before you got here, Aaron Freeman, of the Falcoholic. Before we go any further, though, you say you are a Pitt alum. We don't like much about Pittsburgh here in Cincinnati. Are you a Pittsburgh guy?
I lived there for 4 years when I went to college. Definitely support the school and the football program. The basketball team has been up and down the last couple of years, but this year things finished pretty strong. So I think I'm going to get right back on that bandwagon for Pitt basketball.
Aaron, did you play football there? You look like you're built like a football player.
Yeah, I'm a large human, so did not play football at Pitt, but yeah, definitely have had multiple people make that mistake before.
All right. Well, we thank you for joining us here today, and the great-looking setup you got there. I mean, you got the Falcons parking pass there. You got pictures of the dome, the whole 9 yards. Hey, we're walking through, starting with you. You're our inaugural guest here, and we appreciate your time. Looking at each team in the National Football League, a little more than a month out in the draft. And we asked 3 questions. So I'm going to take one of them at a time, if you don't mind. Where have you been? Where are you now? And where are you going? Falcons last year finished up 7-10. They won their last 2 games of the season after going, I think, through an 11-game stretch where they lost 8 out of the 11 games. It took them out of playoff contention in a down NFC South. You look back on last year, and if you're a Falcons fan, what can you take away on a positive note? And what do you take away saying, man, this was not good?
I think the positives you take is the young core that the Falcons are building. I think several of their 2022 draft picks, including quarterback Desmond Ridder, wide receiver Drake London, running back Tyler Algier, finished the season relatively strong on offense. And I think the Falcons look at that as something that they can build around for the future. They're getting a healthy Kyle Pitts back after he missed the better half of the second half of the season. So I think the Falcons like their young core based off of where they finished last year. And they're putting a lot of confidence in that young core, making a big jump in year 2 for those 2022 draft picks, as well as Kyle Pitts now in year 3 moving forward. So I think the Falcons are in a good spot from where they finished in 2021. I think the area that was probably the biggest question mark for them last season was their defense, and they went into this offseason and went pretty aggressively trying to attack some of their needs there, going out there and getting safety Jesse Bates, linebacker Caden Ellis from the Saints, David Onyemata, the D tackle from the Saints, as well as Calais Campbell from the Baltimore Ravens. So I think the Falcons feel like they're in a good spot, elevating that defense and have a young core and offense to build around.
Okay, last year the team starts with Marcus Mariota as a quarterback. And, hey, look, early in the season, there were signs that this guy was playing up to the billing as a former number 1 pick and all those kinds of things. But then as the season went on, and whether it was, ineffective play, injuries, et cetera, let's zero in on Desmond Ridder, because we have a soft spot in our heart for that young man here. He was an incredible leader, an incredible player, an incredible guy on and off the field here at the University of Cincinnati. You can make an argument that he is the greatest he's the greatest winner in the history of the University of Cincinnati as a quarterback is concerned. What are the thoughts on Ridder? Before we get into some of the other noise out there with Lamar Jackson and so forth, how does the organization, the fan base, everybody feel about him being a starting quarterback potentially for this upcoming season?
Well, the organization since the end of the season has been pretty praising of Desmond Ridder and looking at some of the things that he did in the second half or in the last 4 games of the season as a positive. And I think a lot of people, you mentioned Marcus Mariota starting and then kind of fading towards the end, that led to Ridder getting that promotion. And a lot of people looked at last season as why were the Falcons waiting so long to plug Desmond Ritter? If they really like Desmond Ritter, how come he couldn't beat out Marcus Mariota for the better part of last season, with Mariota starting the first 13 games? And I think a lot of that is owed to something that happened with the Falcons the previous year, where they had a pair of rookies in a second-round safety, Richie Grant, and a third-round guard, Jalen Mayfield. And Mayfield was a player that the Falcons kind of threw to the wolves right away as a starter, and he wasn't ready, and he really struggled in 2021. And Richie Grant was a player that the Falcons were kind of slow playing it. He did get some work in the second half of the season playing in their nickel sub package as a cornerback. And then you saw him make a big jump in year two. And I think the Falcons learned a lesson from that in not wanting to throw a young player out too early before they were 100% confident that they were ready to play. And I think that led to the delay on Desmond Ritter getting some action. But I think the Falcons feel like, with Ritter and some of the things that he showed, especially in those final two games, beating the Arizona Cardinals and beating the Tampa Bay Buccaneers in week 17 and week 18, I think the Falcons feel a lot better going forward with Desmond Ritter being the starter, having a full offseason, getting to work with the starters, something that he did not necessarily do last year, sitting behind Mariota for most of the summer. And I think the Falcons feel really good about, the character, the leadership, all the things that Desmond Ritter showed at Cincinnati for 4 years that led that program to, one of the heights of that program with,
Sure.
making the playoffs that final year. I think the Falcons feel pretty confident that will translate for Desmond Ritter for the Atlanta Falcons.
Talk to me a little bit about the head coach, Arthur Smith. I find him to be an interesting guy, if for no other reason that it is rare to see a former offensive lineman as an NFL head coach. You just don't see that much anymore, even though you talk to most people around football for years and years and years, and most will tell you they believe the smartest players on any given team, college, pro, whatever it might be, outside of the quarterback, would be members of the offensive line. He was with Mike Vrabel down there in Tennessee. This will be his third year coming up. I think his record's 14-20. How do you feel about him as a head coach so far?
Yeah, I mean, you can tell he's a former offensive lineman just because he's kind of a no-nonsense. The sort of identity of the Falcons football is physicality, winning along the line of scrimmage. And so he kind of takes pride on the Falcons being a tough physical football team. And that's something that, is sort of born and bred in offensive linemen, given that they have to play every snap through injuries and are basically constantly, getting into scraps every single down. And that bears out with the identity of the Atlanta Falcons, given their dominant run game that they had a year ago, helmed by Tyler Algier, as I mentioned earlier. I think, the thing with Arthur Smith, he can come off a little prickly to some folks when it comes to, having that sort of no-nonsense approach. But he also has a great sense of humor. So, it's just one of those things with the media that if you ask him the right question, he can be very engaging and entertaining in a lot of ways. But if you ask him the wrong questions, he doesn't necessarily have some of the patience for some of those questions.
Okay. You were talking about Des Ritter. There's still a lot of noise out there, and tell me, what level you think it's noise, what level you think there might be something to it. Lamar Jackson.
I think it's mostly noise at this point. I think with Lamar Jackson, one of the bizarre stories of the offseason has been how very little interest there has been with Lamar Jackson. And for obvious reasons, I think the Falcons made a ton of sense going into the offseason as a potential destination for him. I thought, the Falcons would definitely explore that. From what we've heard from Arthur Smith, that the Falcons have had conversations about it, but they never really ventured down that road too deeply. And, you look at the scheme fit that Lamar Jackson has coming from that Baltimore offense to how some of the ways that Arthur Smith was able to use Marcus Mariota and some of the young pieces that we talked about earlier that the Falcons have. It would make sense for the Atlanta Falcons to bring in someone like Lamar Jackson. Certainly he would be a huge draw for the home crowd. Something that the Falcons necessarily haven't had the last couple of seasons, and goes back to the days of Michael Vick here in Atlanta. So it totally makes sense why so many people thought the Falcons would be sort of the front runners to pursue Lamar Jackson. But we've basically seen from a number of NFL teams, not just the Atlanta Falcons, that there isn't a ton of interest in Lamar Jackson. And I think a lot of it stems from ownership in the NFL not necessarily wanting another sort of big time, fully guaranteed contract based off of all the reports that indicate that's what Lamar Jackson has been seeking from the Baltimore Ravens. And I think that's kind of cooled the market a lot on Lamar Jackson, even though I think everybody acknowledges that he's a really good football player. I think there's reluctance to pay him the type of premium that is reportedly out there for him. And I think it doesn't help that we haven't really seen Lamar Jackson play meaningful football late in the season the last couple of years.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's also scaring off teams that if they're going to pay that huge premium, they want to, bet that money on someone that they are a lot more confident at this point can, play meaningful football in January and potentially into February. And we just haven't seen that with Lamar the last couple of years. And I think for a lot of NFL teams, it's kind of out of sight, out of mind. And that's been cooling the market for Jackson.
Help me here now, Aaron, real quick, because, when we don't follow the Falcons regularly. The Bengals did play the Falcons here last year, but that was, one game in, one game out, off you go. And, Falcons worry about who they worry about. Bengals worry about who they worry about. When I look at the moves that you brought up earlier, especially on the defensive side of the ball that have been made by this franchise, I mean, they're paying veteran players a lot of money. And you're expecting those guys to step in here, play well, provide leadership to a young team right away. Most of the time when you see teams do that, you're looking at a team that is trying to win right now. Yet you and I both know when you're asking a guy to be a full-time starter at the most important position on the field at quarterback, and it's only his second year in the league, and for all intents and purposes, he's a rookie, I don't know what the expectation level would be to try and win. Is it a little baffling to you about the way they're spending money in one regard, but yet they're going to put it all on a young quarterback to try and win now, or am I missing something?
No, I understand why you sort of see that as a little bit incongruent. I think it's really about raising the floor for the Atlanta Falcons. The Falcons aren't that far removed from a season back in 2021 where a lot of people were baffled by how the fact that the Falcons were able to win 7 games when sort of a lot of people observed this team to not necessarily have one of the more talented rosters and one of the least talented rosters in the NFL. And I think for the Falcons, that money that they're spending is to try to, correct that issue, that no one's going to look at this Falcons roster any longer as one of the weaker units in the league. But I think at the same time, the Falcons aren't necessarily in that sort of let's win it all right now. Obviously, the NFC South is a division for the taking. The NFC is not necessarily as strong a conference as, the Bengals play in the AFC, particularly when you look at the quarterback position. So you could see a team like the Atlanta Falcons, and I think this goes back to the Lamar Jackson conversation, why a lot of people are baffled by why is no one pursuing Lamar Jackson, because that would be an absolute home run in the NFC given this current state of that conference. But I think the Falcons, having most recently been in sort of cap nightmare, with paying up a premium to their quarterback position with Matt Ryan, aren't necessarily willing to jump headlong in that. And I think because of that confidence that this team has internally in Desmond Ridder, which is clearly much more than I think what a lot of outside observers seem to have in Ridder moving forward as a starter, I think the Falcons feel like this is not as incongruent a bet going with a young quarterback on offense and having a veteran-laden defense. I think they really do believe that is more than enough for them to compete in the division and potentially at the higher levels of the NFC with time and development.
Yeah, I mean, that's the one thing. And I've always said all the years that I used to broadcast and did a ton of NFC South games, division games, it may not always be the best division in the NFC or the NFL for that matter, but the games are unbelievably competitive in that division. I mean, it's one of the more exciting divisions just to watch divisional matchups. But let's face it, all of a sudden now there are a lot of questions. They're going to be young quarterbacks. Looks like maybe C.J. Stroud or Bryce Young coming into the division. You have Baker Mayfield taking over, down in Tampa Bay, who, look, a lot of people around here in Cincinnati like to badmouth the guy, but he led the Browns to the playoffs and won a playoff game. That's all I know, and he played pretty well with the Rams last year. But it's not a division where you've got one or two juggernauts that you're trying to play catch-up with. All right, now that takes us to the the draft. So this is now where you're going. 8th pick in the draft, I think it is, right? So what are you thinking they do? I mean, do they consider making a trade? Do you think they stay right there at 8? If they stay at 8, what do you think they're looking to do with that pick?
I think they're going to be looking to take the best defensive player available at that 8th overall selection. I think there's been a lot of talk about the Falcons potentially trading up for a quarterback. As I said, I think, again, that's sort of outside observers looking at the Falcons quarterback situation and not necessarily loving Desmond Ridder as much as the Falcons. I think the Falcons are more than content to stay there and just take the best defensive player available to continue that defensive rebuild and add some more talented young pieces on that side of the ball. And, whether it's going to be a local product like Georgia's Jalen Carter, if he slides a little bit in the draft, or Texas Tech's Tyree Wilson, the other pass rusher, or, another addition to the secondary where they could use another young corner opposite A.J. Terrell, one of their up-and-coming defensive stars behind Casey Hayward, an aging veteran cornerback. Someone like Oregon's Christian Gonzalez makes a ton of sense for the Atlanta Falcons. So I think they're going to probably stay put at 8, take the best defensive player available. They might contemplate a trade back if one of the top 4 quarterbacks falls to that point, and maybe a team picking behind them, a team like Tennessee or Washington or somebody like that is looking to move up in the draft, and the Falcons can put themselves, move back, still be able to get a good defensive player, maybe add early round picks in 2024. That is going to be very enticing option for them, especially even though they're confident in Desmond Ridder. You do want to potentially set yourself up for, future success if you want to potentially make a change at the quarterback position a year from now. Having that additional ammunition in the draft in 2024 totally makes sense. So I think the Falcons will probably stay put, take the best defensive player available. But if there is going to be a trade involving that 8th overall selection, it'll probably be more likely to be the Falcons moving back than necessarily moving up.
All right, last 2 things I want to ask you about, and we appreciate your time. Speaking of Carter, everybody knows the whole situation with, the tragedy that took place where a couple of young people involved with the Georgia football program lost their lives. It's a very sad thing, tragically sad, heartbreaking. Then all of a sudden, people said he had put on weight by the time of the end of the regular season or the end of the national championship season to all of a sudden his pro day and his workout day. What's a word on Carter? I mean, are these legitimate questions as to, this was a guy a lot of people were saying might be the first pick in the draft 2 months ago.
Yeah, I think that's the thing that NFL teams have to wrap their minds around. They have to really dig deep on the person that they're getting with Jalen Carter. Made some very questionable decisions on that fateful night back in January. And I think the main concern that NFL teams have, given that you're going to have a lot more time on your own, on your hands in the NFL, you're going to have a lot more money to spend. If this is a one bad night of mistakes that Jalen Carter make, or is this a pattern of behavior that he, with greater resources and assets that he may have as a professional football player, will you see this as a series of mistakes? And that's something that NFL teams are going to have to decide on their own. I think what we've learned in the past when it comes to, quote unquote character concerns in NFL teams, that NFL teams will basically look away, sort of turn the other cheek when it comes to that stuff. When it comes to character concerns, if you are a talented enough player. Mm-hmm. And I think in the case of Jalen Carter, he is one of those rare players that is talented enough that NFL teams will be willing to bet on the player on the field as opposed to worrying about the player off the field. How that affects his draft stock remains to be seen. I still expect him to be a top 10 pick, but it could work that some teams are a little bit more worried about it than before. And being, as you said, the guy that was potentially the first non-quarterback off the board at the very early parts of the draft, do we see, 3, 4, 5 other guys that are non-quarterbacks come off the board earlier than Jalen Carter, and that puts him in a position to slide a little bit on draft night.
Well, Aaron, we cannot thank you enough for your time, young man, especially on such short notice. Obviously, you're on your game down there for those that want to check him out. Host of at Locked On Falcons podcast. You write occasionally for the Falcoholic. So I'm sure you're going to be very busy here, young man, over the next month and a half, 2 months covering Falcons football.
I appreciate you having me on.
All right, Aaron Freeman, kind enough to join us. Great having him. And that's the way we start our draft coverage right here on Off the Bench. Now, that is a rock-solid opening guest right there. That dude's on his game.